A German Shepherd worth $300, rejected by everyone, clung tightly to a veteran's leg, begging him not to leave. Why did this unwanted German Shepherd choose that one veteran when everyone else had turned him away? And what made him cling so tightly, as if letting go was the one thing he simply could not bear? Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're grateful to have you here with us today. If you enjoy heartfelt stories about loyalty, compassion, and the extraordinary bonds between people and animals, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Thank you sincerely for watching, supporting, and being part of this growing community. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Now, let's begin. Sometimes the ones who stop asking to be chosen are the ones praying hardest that someone will stay. By 4:30 on a gray November afternoon, the adoption floor at Pine Ridge Animal Shelter had begun to settle into that tired kind of quiet that comes after too many footsteps. Rain whispered against the front windows. Fluorescent lights hummed above two long rows of kennels, and the clean, sharp smell of disinfectant mingled with damp fur and the faint trace of coffee cooling behind the reception desk. At the far end of the second row lay Atlas, 4 years old, male, German Shepherd. His sable coat was thick around the neck, darker along his back, and his amber eyes followed every visitor without the hopeful excitement they once might have held. A laminated card hung beside his kennel door. Atlas, adoption fee, $300. He had been there long enough to recognize the little rituals people performed before deciding against him. They slowed down. They read his card. They looked through the gate. Sometimes they smiled. Then came the glance toward another kennel, followed by footsteps moving away. That afternoon, a young couple stopped with their daughter. Atlas raised his head. The girl crouched and smiled through the gate. For one brief second, his ears lifted. "He's beautiful," her mother whispered. Her father studied Atlas, then looked farther down the row, where a smaller dog bounced excitedly against its kennel door. "Maybe we should meet that one first." Their daughter stood. 3 sets of footsteps faded down the concrete aisle. Atlas watched until they disappeared around the corner. Then he lowered his head between his paws again. No bark, no whine. 10 minutes later, another visitor came through. A middle-aged man in a blue work jacket stopped at Atlas's card and asked Megan Brooks, the shelter worker nearby, $300? Megan nodded. "That covers the adoption and his basic veterinary care." The man looked at Atlas for several seconds. "Big dog. He is. Probably eats a lot." Megan gave a small, patient smile. "He likes breakfast." The man almost laughed, but his attention had already shifted toward the exit. Atlas never stood. The front door opened, letting in a ribbon of cold air and the wet smell of pavement. It closed again. Atlas's eyes remained on the empty aisle. Megan lingered beside his kennel. "You're making this hard on me, buddy," she murmured. Atlas blinked once. Near closing time, the bell over the lobby door sounded again. A man stepped inside, wiping rain from the shoulders of an old olive field jacket. He was tall, broad through the chest, with close-cut brown hair touched by gray at the temples. His name was Daniel Mercer, 42 years old, former United States Marine. He carried himself with the quiet precision of someone who still noticed exits without meaning to. Daniel exchanged a few words with the receptionist, then walked toward the kennels. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't searching eagerly from side to side. He simply moved down the aisle with his hands in his jacket pockets while dogs barked, tails struck metal gates, and hopeful noses pressed through narrow spaces. Atlas did nothing. Daniel passed one kennel, then another, then another. When he reached the final enclosure, his boots slowed. Atlas's eyes lifted first, then his head. Daniel stopped beneath the laminated card and read it silently. Atlas, German Shepherd, $300. For several seconds, neither moved. Rain tapped softly against the distant windows. Daniel looked through the gate. Atlas stared back. Something in the dog's expression made Daniel remain there longer than he intended. Not excitement, not fear. It was the stillness that caught him. The look of a creature that had watched enough people leave to stop believing footsteps could ever mean anything else. Daniel took one step closer, and for the first time that afternoon, Atlas stood. Atlas rose slowly, almost cautiously, as though standing for the wrong person had disappointed him before. Daniel Mercer remained outside the kennel, one hand buried in the pocket of his olive field jacket while rain traced silver lines down the windows behind him. Around them, the shelter carried on with its evening sounds, a bowl sliding across concrete, a distant bark, the soft click of a kennel latch. Yet Daniel barely noticed any of it. Atlas was watching him differently. Not his face, not his hands, his boots. Daniel shifted his weight. The German shepherd's amber eyes followed the movement immediately. When Daniel stepped half a pace to the left, Atlas tracked his feet again. It was subtle enough that another visitor might have missed it. Daniel did not. Years in the United States Marine Corps had taught him to notice what moved when everything else remained still. "You expecting me to go somewhere?" he murmured. Atlas's ears tilted forward at the sound of his voice. Megan Brooks approached from the end of the aisle carrying a folded blanket. She stopped when she saw the dog standing. "Well," she said quietly, "that is new." Daniel glanced at her. "What is?" "He usually stays down for strangers now." Daniel looked back through the gate. "Maybe he likes the jacket." Megan smiled faintly. "Maybe." She opened the kennel and asked Daniel whether he wanted to meet Atlas in the small visiting room. Daniel hesitated. "I am not here to adopt today." "You do not have to be." Something about that answer removed the pressure from the moment. Daniel nodded. The visiting room was simple. Pale walls, 2 chairs, a rubber mat, and a narrow window overlooking the wet parking lot. Megan brought Atlas inside on a loose leash, then handed it to Daniel. Atlas did not rush him. He approached slowly, sniffed the cuff of Daniel's jeans, then lowered his nose toward the worn leather boots. Daniel crouched. Up close, he could see faint gray beginning around the shepherd's muzzle, though Atlas was only 4. "Hey, big guy." Atlas lifted his eyes. Daniel extended his hand without reaching for him. After several seconds, Atlas leaned forward and touched his nose to Daniel's knuckles. That was all. Somehow, it felt like more. Daniel sat on the floor instead of taking the chair. Atlas remained standing beside him, close enough that Daniel could feel the warmth coming from his coat. "What happened to him?" Daniel asked. Megan's expression changed. "Not dramatically, just enough. He has had a hard time finding the right place." "That is not what I asked." Megan looked toward Atlas. "No, it is not." She sat across from Daniel. "He has been returned more than once. Different reasons. Too big, too quiet, too attached. People always seem to have a reason." Daniel ran his thumb slowly across an old crease in his palm. "And now he watches doors." Daniel looked down. Atlas was not watching the door. He was watching Daniel's boots again. Megan noticed it too. "People think dogs remember faces," she said softly. "Sometimes I think they remember departures." Daniel said nothing. The words settled somewhere uncomfortable. Outside, headlights swept across the window as another car left the parking lot. Atlas stiffened for a moment, then moved closer until his shoulder touched Daniel's knee. Daniel rested his hand lightly against the shepherd's neck. The contact was warm, careful, almost accidental. For several quiet minutes, neither seemed interested in changing it. Then Daniel looked at the clock above the door. 5 minutes before closing. He exhaled and slowly pushed himself to his feet. Atlas rose instantly. Daniel reached for the leash to return it to Megan. "He is a good dog," he said. Megan studied him. "He is." Daniel nodded, already retreating into the familiar safety of politeness. "I should get going." He turned toward the door. Behind him came the soft scrape of paws against the floor. Daniel stopped. Atlas had followed him as far as the leash allowed, his body perfectly still, his amber eyes fixed once more on Daniel's boots. Daniel stood with his hand on the visiting room door, but something about Atlas made him hesitate. The German shepherd had reached the end of the leash and stopped there, watching Daniel with a stillness that felt heavier than barking ever could. Megan held the leash loosely. She did not pull him back. "He knows you are leaving," she said. Daniel looked at Atlas. Dogs are good at that. Atlas is better than most. Daniel almost smiled, but the expression never fully arrived. He returned to the chair and sat down. Atlas immediately crossed the small room and settled beside his boots. The change was so quick that Daniel noticed it. Standing meant departure. Sitting meant safety. He rested both hands on his knees. "You said he was returned more than once." Megan nodded. 3 times since he came here." Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. 3. The first family kept him for 11 days. The second lasted about a month. The last adoption ended after 1 weekend. Atlas leaned against Daniel's shin as if the conversation belonged to someone else. "Was he difficult?" Daniel asked. No aggressive. No sick. Healthy. Daniel looked down at him. Then what was wrong? Megan took a moment before answering. Nothing was wrong with Atlas. People just kept expecting him to become whatever dog they imagined before they met him. Daniel understood that sentence more than he wanted to. After leaving the Marine Corps, people had expected things from him too. Relief. Freedom. A fresh start. They spoke about civilian life as though someone simply opened a gate and every old weight fell from your shoulders. Daniel had learned to nod when they said it. His house sat 12 miles outside town, a modest one-story place bordered by pine trees and an aging wooden fence. There was enough room for a dog. More than enough. What it lacked was noise. Daniel had lived alone there for nearly 4 years. He kept the kitchen clean, the lawn trimmed, and the porch light working. He repaired things before they broke. He paid bills before they were due. Everything had its place because order asked nothing from him emotionally. A dog would. Daniel looked at the shepherd beside him and felt the old instinct rise. Leave before something depends on you. Megan placed a clipboard on the small table. You do not have to decide tonight, she said. Daniel glanced at the adoption form. His eyes stopped at the blank line waiting for a signature. For a strange second, the room seemed quieter. He picked up the pen. Atlas lifted his head. Daniel read the first page. Then the second. Food. Exercise. Veterinary care. Emergency contact. Commitment written in ordinary black ink. His thumb moved over the pen clip. An old memory surfaced without invitation. Another promise. Another goodbye. Another empty place afterward. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, Atlas was watching him. Trusting him already, perhaps too easily. That frightened Daniel more than anything else. He set the pen down. I cannot. Megan did not argue. All right. Daniel stood. Atlas stood with him. I am sorry, Daniel said, though he was not certain whether he meant the words for Megan, Atlas, or himself. Megan reached for the leash. Daniel stepped toward the door. One step, then another. Behind him, Atlas began following. Daniel kept moving. The leash tightened gently. Atlas stopped. Daniel reached for the handle. The shepherd's breathing changed. A soft whine escaped him, so quiet Daniel almost missed it. He turned. Atlas was staring at his boots again. Not at the door. Not at Megan. At the boots. Daniel swallowed and looked away. Take care of him. He opened the door. Atlas moved before Megan could say his name. Atlas crossed the distance in 2 quick strides. The leash slipped through Megan's fingers just enough to give him room. And before Daniel could understand what was happening, the German shepherd pressed himself against Daniel's leg. Then Atlas lifted both front paws and wrapped them around Daniel's shin. Daniel froze. The shelter seemed to freeze with him. Atlas did not bark. He did not pull toward the hallway or scratch at the door. He simply held on. His chest rested against Daniel's knee, his head tucked beside the worn leather of Daniel's boot, and a faint trembling moved through his body. Atlas, Megan whispered. She stepped forward, but Daniel raised one hand. Wait. Megan stopped. Daniel looked down. He had spent years learning how to read uncertainty in people, how to notice a tightened jaw or a hand that moved too quickly, but there was nothing complicated about what he saw now. Atlas was afraid. Not of Daniel. Of the space Daniel was about to leave behind. Daniel slowly lowered himself until one knee touched the rubber floor. Atlas adjusted immediately, keeping one paw across Daniel's leg as though even that small connection mattered. Easy, buddy, Daniel said. His voice came out quieter than he expected. Atlas lifted his head. Amber eyes met gray-green ones. For a moment Daniel saw no trained animal, no adoption fee, no paperwork waiting on a table. He saw a living creature asking a question without knowing how to form it. Are you going too? Daniel swallowed. Does he do this with everyone? Megan shook her head. I have never seen him do this. From the hallway came the metallic click of another kennel closing for the night. Atlas flinched at the sound, then tightened his paw around Daniel's leg. Daniel felt it. So did Megan. He knows the routine, she said. Lights dim. Doors close. People leave. Daniel ran his hand gently along Atlas's shoulder. Beneath the thick sable coat, the dog felt solid and warm, but the trembling remained. And tomorrow they come back. Megan looked toward the window, where November rain blurred the parking lot lights into pale gold streaks. We know that. Daniel understood what she meant. Atlas only knew what happened in the moment. A person stood. Boots turned toward a door. Footsteps moved away. Whatever came tomorrow could not change the sound of leaving tonight. Daniel shifted slightly. Atlas washed his boots. Again. Always the boots. Daniel sat fully on the floor. Almost instantly, Atlas relaxed. His paws slipped down, but instead of moving away, he placed his body across Daniel's feet. Megan exhaled softly. Daniel stared at the shepherd. You really do not like goodbyes. Atlas rested his chin on Daniel's ankle. Something tightened behind Daniel's ribs. He had spent 4 years constructing a life where goodbyes could not surprise him, because almost nobody came close enough to require one. His house was quiet by design. His phone rarely rang. Holidays were manageable because he treated them like ordinary days. He had convinced himself that solitude was peace. Sitting on a shelter floor with 80 pounds of German Shepherd covering his boots, Daniel suddenly wondered whether peace and emptiness had simply learned to wear the same clothes. Megan sat in the chair, but said nothing. She seemed to understand that persuasion would ruin whatever was happening. Daniel looked toward the adoption papers. The pen still rested exactly where he had left it. He could reach for it. He could also stand and walk away. Both choices were only a few feet from him. Tell me something, Daniel finally said. Megan waited. Daniel kept his hand on Atlas's neck. What happened before he came here? Megan's expression softened, but sadness entered her eyes. That is a longer story. Daniel looked down as Atlas breathed warmly against his boot. Outside, rain continued tapping against the glass. Closing time had arrived. Daniel did not stand. I have time. Megan looked at the clock, then at Daniel sitting on the floor with Atlas stretched across his boots. The shelter was officially closed now. Somewhere beyond the visiting room, the lobby lights clicked off one row at a time. He came to us 8 months ago, she began. A county officer found him wandering near a rural highway about 20 miles north of town. He had a collar, but no identification tag. No microchip. We posted notices and contacted every clinic nearby. Nobody claimed him. Daniel kept his hand against Atlas's neck. So you do not know who owned him? Not for certain. Megan folded her hands. But we know what happened afterward. She explained that Atlas had been adopted 3 weeks after arriving. His first family had 2 children and a fenced yard. Everything looked right on paper. 11 days later, they brought him back. They said he followed them everywhere and became anxious whenever someone prepared to leave. The second adopter was a retired teacher who genuinely tried. Atlas stayed with him for nearly a month, but the man's health changed, and caring for a large dog became more than he could manage. Daniel glanced down. Atlas had closed his eyes, though one ear remained angled toward Megan's voice. And the weekend? Daniel asked. Megan hesitated. A couple took him home on Friday. They returned him Sunday afternoon. Why? They said he was too attached. Daniel's hand stopped moving. Too attached. He waited outside every closed door, followed them from room to room. If they put on shoes or picked up car keys, he became restless. Megan's voice remained gentle. They wanted a dog that was more independent. Rain softened against the glass. Daniel stared at the worn toes of his boots beneath Atlas's chest. Suddenly the pattern seemed painfully simple. Shoes, keys, doors, footsteps, the ordinary language of leaving. So every time somebody walked away from him, Daniel said, he learned to watch closer the next time. Megan nodded. That is my guess. Daniel breathed slowly through his nose. Poor guy. The words were almost inaudible. Atlas opened his eyes. Daniel had spent years believing that leaving first was a kind of protection. After his service ended, invitations from old friends went unanswered. Calls became shorter. Holiday visits became excuses about weather, work, or traffic. Nothing dramatic happened. Daniel simply made his world smaller until there were fewer people capable of disappearing from it. Sitting there, he realized Atlas had solved the same problem in the opposite way. Daniel kept distance. Atlas refused to allow it. One withdrew before goodbye could arrive. The other watched every footstep, desperate to stop it. Megan rose and crossed to a cabinet, returning with a thin paper folder. This is his shelter record. Daniel accepted it. Medical examinations, vaccinations, adoption dates, returns, notes written by different hands. Near the bottom of one page, a sentence had been underlined. Becomes distressed when household members prepare to leave. Daniel read it twice. People wrote this like it was something wrong with him. People write down what they can observe, Megan said. They do not always know what it means. Daniel closed the folder. Atlas shifted closer. placing his muzzle over Daniel's ankle again. The gesture was so trusting that Daniel felt ashamed of the door behind him. "You know what is strange?" he said. Megan waited. "I came here because my neighbor asked me to donate some old blankets." He gave a quiet, humorless laugh. "They are still in my truck." Megan smiled. "Then I suppose Atlas owes your neighbor a thank you." Daniel looked toward the adoption form. The pen remained beside it. His eyes lingered there, but he did not reach for it. Not yet. Instead, he leaned back against the wall and rested his palm on Atlas's shoulder. Outside, the last car in the parking lot pulled away. Atlas heard it and lifted his head. Daniel stayed exactly where he was. After a few seconds, the shepherd lowered his head again. For once, footsteps had disappeared into the night, and the man beside him had not. Daniel remained on the floor long after the shelter should have gone dark. Megan did not hurry him. She gathered the empty water bowls from the visiting room, returned a few minutes later, and found him exactly where she had left him, one hand resting on Atlas while the German shepherd slept across his boots. The rain had weakened to a mist. Beyond the window, the parking lot shone beneath the lamps like black glass. Daniel finally looked toward the clipboard. "How much did you say?" Megan followed his gaze. $300. Daniel shook his head. "No." Megan waited. "How long has he been waiting?" 8 months. The answer seemed to land differently. Daniel looked at Atlas. 8 months of kennel doors opening for other dogs. 8 months of strangers stopping, considering, leaving. 8 months was long enough to learn the rhythm of disappointment. Daniel slowly reached for the clipboard. Atlas woke when the paper shifted. His ears rose, but he stayed over Daniel's feet. "You know," Daniel murmured. "This is a terrible way to make a first impression." Atlas blinked. Megan smiled. "I think he would disagree." Daniel picked up the pen. His fingers tightened around it, then stopped above the signature line. For a moment, an older silence returned to him. For years earlier, after leaving the United States Marine Corps, Daniel had promised himself that his life would become simpler. No one depending on him. No promises he might fail to keep. No empty chair that could suddenly mean more than furniture. He had mistaken distance for protection because distance had never asked him to risk his heart. Atlas shifted and placed one paw across Daniel's boot. Daniel stared at it. "You really do not make this easy." Megan leaned against the wall. "Maybe easy is not what either of you needs." Daniel looked at her, then back at the form. He signed his name, Daniel Mercer. The ink dried quickly. Nothing thundered. No music filled the room. Atlas did not understand what had happened. He only knew the man was still sitting beside him. Megan took the clipboard and quietly reviewed the paperwork. "There are a few things we need to finish tomorrow morning. Final veterinary clearance, identification registration, food instructions." Daniel nodded. "Tomorrow. We can open early." Daniel looked toward Atlas. The dog's body had relaxed completely now, so I still have to leave him tonight. Megan's expression softened. "For one night." Daniel exhaled. He understood immediately what that would look like through Atlas's eyes. A signature meant nothing to a dog. Tomorrow meant nothing. Promises were sounds until someone returned. Daniel rose carefully. Atlas stood at once. This time Daniel did not turn toward the door immediately. He crouched and placed both hands along the shepherd's neck. "Listen to me, buddy." Atlas watched him. "I have to go home." One ear tilted. "But I am coming back." Daniel almost laughed at himself. He was explaining tomorrow to a dog who had every reason not to believe in it. Still, he continued. "First thing in the morning." Atlas leaned forward until his forehead rested against Daniel's chest. Daniel closed his eyes. For several seconds, he held him there. Then he stood. Atlas watched the boots. 1 step. 2. Daniel reached the doorway and looked back. Atlas had not followed. He stood beside Megan, tense but quiet. "Tomorrow," Daniel repeated. Outside, cold air met him beneath the shelter awning. He walked toward his truck, then stopped halfway across the wet parking lot. Through the visiting room window, he could see Atlas still watching. Daniel lifted one hand. The shepherd remained motionless. Daniel climbed into the truck, but before starting the engine, he noticed the old blankets stacked on the passenger seat. He smiled for the first time that evening. "Almost forgot why I came." He carried them back inside. When the door opened again, Atlas heard Daniel's footsteps returning. His tail moved once against the floor. Daniel did not know it yet, but that small movement was the beginning of something neither of them had trusted for a long time. Someone leaving and coming back. Daniel returned the next morning before sunrise had fully cleared the pine trees. The storm was gone, leaving the road dark and wet beneath a pale November sky. His truck rolled into the shelter parking lot at 7:20, 40 minutes before the doors normally opened. Megan was already waiting beneath the awning with 2 paper cups of coffee. Through the glass behind her, Atlas stood in the lobby. The moment Daniel stepped from the truck, the shepherd's ears rose. Daniel closed the door and started across the pavement. Atlas watched every step. Then his tail moved. Once. Twice. By the time Megan opened the shelter door, it was sweeping steadily behind him. "You remembered," she said. Daniel accepted the coffee. "I said I would come back." Megan glanced at Atlas. "I was not talking to you." Daniel looked through the doorway and understood. Atlas had spent the night with one question that paperwork could not answer. Would those boots return? Daniel entered slowly. Atlas approached, sniffed his jeans, then pressed his forehead against Daniel's thigh. No desperate grip this time. Just contact. Daniel rested a hand between his ears. "Morning, buddy." The final veterinary check took less than 20 minutes. Dr. Emily Carter examined Atlas while Daniel listened carefully to every instruction about food, exercise, vaccinations, and routine. Atlas was healthy, though Emily recommended patience while he adjusted. "Do not measure progress by whether he follows you," she told Daniel. "Measure it by the day he realizes he does not have to." Daniel carried that sentence with him. By 8:15, the forms were complete. Megan handed him a blue leash, a small bag of food, Atlas's records, and a metal identification tag engraved with Daniel's phone number. Daniel turned the tag over in his palm. Such a small thing. A name on one side, a way home on the other. Outside, Atlas hesitated at the truck. Daniel opened the passenger door, spread one of the donated blankets across the seat, and waited. After several seconds, Atlas climbed inside. During the 12-mile drive, he remained upright, watching Daniel whenever the truck slowed. At every traffic light, his ears shifted forward. At every turn, his eyes moved toward the door. Daniel kept one hand on the steering wheel. "Still here," he said quietly. The house appeared between tall pines near the end of a narrow county road. One story, white siding, green shutters, a weathered porch. Daniel parked beside the garage and stepped out. Atlas immediately followed. Inside, the house smelled faintly of coffee, cedar, and furniture polish. It was almost unnaturally orderly. Daniel unclipped the leash. Atlas did not explore. He followed Daniel into the kitchen, then the hallway, then the living room. When Daniel walked back to the kitchen, Atlas came too. "You know you are allowed to have your own opinions," Daniel said. Atlas sat beside him. Daniel filled a water bowl. Atlas drank only after Daniel remained nearby. Later, Daniel stepped outside to retrieve the food from the truck. The front door closed for less than 30 seconds. When he returned, Atlas was standing inches from it, body tense, eyes fixed on the handle. Daniel entered and set the bag down. "I told you. I come back." Atlas leaned against his leg. That evening, Daniel placed a new dog bed beside the couch. Atlas ignored it and settled across Daniel's feet instead. The television remained off. Wind moved softly through the pines outside. For years, Daniel had believed silence was what he wanted. Now the room held another sound, the slow breathing of a German shepherd asleep against his boots. Daniel looked down and realized the house no longer felt quiet. It felt occupied. Near midnight, Daniel rose to turn off the kitchen light. Atlas woke instantly and followed. Daniel stopped in the hallway. "You do not have to follow every step." Atlas stared at him. Daniel smiled faintly. "We will work on that." He returned to the living room and sat beside the dog bed. After a long hesitation, Atlas climbed onto it. Daniel remained there until the shepherd's eyes closed. Only then did he whisper, "You are home." 3 weeks passed, and Atlas learned the geography of Daniel's life. Morning coffee meant the kitchen. The old green jacket meant a walk along the pine road. The leather boots by the front door meant something more complicated. At first, Daniel could not cross the room without Atlas rising behind him. If he opened the refrigerator, Atlas came. If he carried laundry down the hall, Atlas followed. If the bathroom door closed, a sable shadow waited outside until it opened again. Daniel never punished him for it. He simply began turning ordinary moments into small promises. Getting the mail. Then he returned. Taking out the trash. Then he returned. Checking the truck. Then he returned. 30 seconds became 2 minutes. 2 minutes became 5. Each time the front door opened again, Atlas greeted him as though Daniel had crossed an ocean instead of a porch. One cold Tuesday morning, Daniel received a call from the veterans clinic in town. He had forgotten about an appointment scheduled months earlier. The drive would take 20 minutes each way, and the appointment might last an hour. Daniel looked toward Atlas. The shepherd was asleep near the fireplace, one paw resting over his nose. Daniel considered rescheduling. Then he remembered Dr. Emily Carter's words. Progress was not measured by how closely Atlas followed him. It was measured by the day Atlas understood he did not have to. Daniel showered, dressed, and reached for his boots. Atlas woke immediately. The room changed. His head lifted. His ears came forward. Daniel tied the first boot. Atlas stood. He tied the second. Atlas crossed the room. When Daniel picked up his truck keys, the shepherd's breathing quickened. 3 weeks of gentle routines suddenly seemed very small against 8 months of uncertainty. Daniel crouched. Atlas pressed close enough that his chest touched Daniel's knees. I have to go into town. Atlas stared at him. Daniel placed both hands along the shepherd's neck. You are staying here. Atlas's eyes shifted toward the door. And I am coming back. Daniel said the words slowly, not because Atlas understood every syllable, but because promises deserved to sound deliberate. He left a worn blanket beside the couch and turned on the radio at low volume. Then he opened the front door. Cold air entered with the scent of pine. Atlas moved forward. Daniel raised his palm gently. Stay. Atlas stopped. Daniel stepped onto the porch. The shepherd's body tightened. Daniel closed the door. For several seconds, he stood outside with his hand still on the knob. Every instinct told him to reopen it. Instead, he walked to the truck. Inside the house, Atlas remained near the door. Minutes passed. The familiar engine faded down the county road. Atlas paced from the entryway to the front window, then back again. He sniffed Daniel's blanket, but did not lie down. The house felt larger without footsteps moving through it. At the clinic, Daniel checked the clock twice before his name was called, and 4 more times during the appointment. When it ended, he drove directly home. 47 minutes after leaving, his truck turned onto the narrow road between the pines. Atlas heard the engine before it reached the driveway. He ran to the window. Daniel parked, climbed out, and walked toward the porch. Through the glass, he saw Atlas standing perfectly still. Daniel opened the door. Atlas rushed forward, then stopped inches away, as though disbelief had interrupted joy. Daniel knelt. Told you. Atlas touched his nose to Daniel's face, then leaned his full weight against Daniel's chest. Daniel wrapped one arm around him. I came back. That evening, Daniel put on his boots to bring firewood from the porch. Atlas watched. He stood, took one step toward him, then stopped. Daniel went outside. When he returned a minute later, Atlas was waiting several feet from the door. Not pressed against it. Not trembling. Just waiting. Daniel noticed. He said, nothing. Some victories were too quiet for celebration. By late February, winter had begun loosening its grip on the county road. Patches of snow disappeared beneath the pines, and afternoon sunlight lingered a little longer across Daniel's porch. Atlas had changed in ways that would have been easy to miss if someone only visited once. He still followed Daniel into the kitchen most mornings, but sometimes he remained asleep when Daniel crossed the room. He still watched the truck keys, but his breathing no longer changed when Daniel picked them up. Most important, the front door had stopped looking like an ending. Daniel had changed too. His neighbor, Walter Hayes, noticed first. Walter was 67, retired, and responsible for the blankets that had brought Daniel to the shelter months earlier. One Saturday morning, he found Daniel repairing a loose porch board while Atlas slept nearby in a patch of sunlight. That dog finally letting you work alone? Walter asked. Daniel glanced toward Atlas. He is supervising. Walter smiled. Looks more like sleeping. Management. Atlas opened one eye, then closed it again. Walter laughed. Daniel did too. The sound surprised him. There had been a time when laughter in that yard felt like something belonging to another family, another house. Now it came easily enough to drift between the trees. That afternoon, Daniel decided to drive into town for groceries. He showered, changed his shirt, and reached for the same leather boots Atlas had once washed with such fear. Atlas lifted his head from the living room rug. Daniel tied one boot, then the other. Atlas remained where he was. Daniel picked up his keys. One ear rose. That was all. Daniel stood near the door and looked back. I am heading out. Atlas watched him. Back soon, buddy. For several seconds, neither moved. Months earlier, Daniel would have crouched beside him, repeated the promise, and worried all the way to the truck. This time he simply opened the door. Cold sunlight fell across the floor. Atlas did not rush forward. He did not stand. His tail tapped once against the rug. Daniel felt something catch in his throat. He smiled. Good boy. Then he stepped outside and closed the door. Atlas listened as the boots crossed the porch. He heard the truck start. He heard the engine fade down the road. Then the house became quiet. But quiet no longer meant abandoned. Atlas lowered his head onto his paws. 28 minutes later, the familiar engine returned. Before Daniel reached the porch, Atlas was waiting in the hallway, tail moving steadily. Not desperately, just happily. Daniel entered carrying 2 grocery bags. See? Atlas sniffed one bag with great interest. Daniel laughed. Yes, I brought something for you. He set the groceries on the counter and pulled out a small package of dog treats. Atlas sat immediately. Now you remember your manners. Daniel gave him one, then carried the bags into the kitchen. Atlas stayed behind for a moment. Daniel noticed and stopped. The shepherd was standing beside the front door, looking at it calmly. Around his neck, the metal identification tag caught a narrow beam of afternoon light. His name on one side, Daniel's phone number on the other. Away home, Daniel walked back and rested his hand between Atlas's ears. The shepherd leaned against him, not because he feared Daniel would disappear, but because affection had finally become different from fear. That evening they sat together on the porch as sunset turned the sky pale gold behind the pines. Atlas lay beside Daniel's chair, his head near the old leather boots. Daniel watched the road in silence. He thought about the man who had once made his world smaller so nobody could leave it. He thought about the dog who had once held on because he believed every departing footstep might be forever. Neither had fixed the other. Something gentler had happened. Day after day, promise after promise, they had simply taught each other that love did not always vanish when a door closed. Sometimes it went out into the world for a little while. And then, quietly, faithfully, it came home.